Hey, this is Gary with Sparkbox. Today we're going to be talking about decoupling delivery and release. And often these terms are used interchangeably. They're not. We're going to compare and contrast them to help you build a more sustainable software delivery pipeline. Let's get to it. This talk is presented as part of our Sustainable Software Workshop, and hopefully we will see you at one of those sometime soon. Let's look at the definitions for delivery and for features and see how they differ so that we can compare the two or contrast them. For deployment or delivery, these are software changes that are promoted up through the environment via the pipeline, through dev, staging, production, but the features aren't necessarily available yet to the users. They are mostly supporting an upcoming feature, most likely. And that brings us to the release. The release is when the new feature itself is actually available to the user. It's a very big difference, and we're going to see how that can make your software deployments and deliveries and releases much smaller and controlled and lower risk. Let's establish the baseline for our decoupling example. Early efforts in an application for login support consisted of a JWT authentication scheme that was one-time use. For our MVP login, we could break down two of the main components using these OAuth 2 roles. For our front end or our React app, we had a client application would be considered, and the API was the resource server. Also, in the early stage of the development, of course, it was completely reasonable to also expect that the API would also serve as our authorization server. Given those OAuth 2 roles, the application protocol is pretty much what you'd expect. The client application would post to sessions, the API would look for the username and password. If it agreed with those, then you'd be granted a signed secure JWT issued from the API. Then every request after that, for instance, to get dashboard information, would provide the JWT in an authorization header. And the data would be provided back with a brand new JWT to use for the next request. So with that initial bit of functionality completed, we released, and it served the app for a good long while. So now we're at a crucial place where we should start considering those differences between delivery and release. The app is successful, and the client would like us to add more behavior. How can we do that? Continue to provide a high throughput of new features, and at the same time minimize the risks for those deployments and allow us to stay on the happy path. In this example, the client would like us to extend login to other authentication forms. It's no longer enough to have just our in-house username and password database that we have. Instead, we need to be able to supply support for enterprise customers who have other needs, their own enterprise portals, and that called for supporting SAML authentication so that their clients would actually have a good experience. And that's what we'll begin talking about, breaking out these two different ideas of delivery and release so that we can keep our code base, our code changes small, and get those into production as soon as possible. Okay, it's time to kick off this effort. We decided to go with Auth0 as our authorization server moving forward once the feature is released. That would be taking away the responsibilities of the API for our local code, our local database of our users, as well as supporting our enterprise clients. Now, it's completely reasonable to think that a lot of teams would say, okay, well, we would like to have a feature branch. We're going to name it maybe Auth0 effort or something like that, and start working on that at the same time other development is happening. When we start decoupling release from delivery, that's not necessarily the case. We don't really want to have a long-lived feature branch. This is a pretty decent-sized effort. This code has been ingrained in the application for quite some time, and we need to start to tease it apart. So having a shorter branch, shorter-lived branches would let us follow more the spirit of continuous integration. We're going to get smaller changes into our main line more often. And we're also going to have the opportunity to maintain releasability of that master branch and getting into production much sooner and much more frequently. We get practice deploying it out there, and also we'll be able to exercise it through various techniques. Here's a great quote for developing your spidey sense for these types of things. Decoupling deployment from release or delivery from release is not necessarily harder in all situations. Sometimes it is, but it tends to require a bit more coordination and communication within the team. So, after talking about our strategy for getting Auth0 integrated into the application, we determined our order of operations, basically. What are the dependencies that don't have dependencies themselves? There are several tools that can help you find those. Everything from just, knowing the domain, trusting your gut to guide you in certain directions. Also, a tool that I like to use is called the Mikado method. It basically just allows you to trace your dependencies transitively up until you don't have any more. And so on those outer leaves, I guess, if you will, of the dependency graph, you can start tackling those tasks. So once we have those, then we just pick those outer leaves, start working on them. And the first one that we identified was the back-end integration with Auth0 to our API. Auth0 was going to need to know information about our users and some information about them to proceed with the authentication. So we had to supply the 2 endpoints. We did that, and we were able to go and promote these as deliveries up through our environments. Dev staging passes QA in there. We got to go to production. I felt tons better getting this first start into production, knowing that we had Auth0 integrated in the back end, and that could be exercised by testers, ourselves, anybody else interested in knowing whether or not we got that piece right and did not affect any of the other flow of the application. So that is a great early win for the team. Fresh off that first win, we decided to go ahead and tackle another API task. This one was just API focused that we identified from our dependencies. And so we didn't need Auth0 or the front end yet. We still were using Passport, JWT, a library for handling our authentication with JSON web tokens. And this particular task was now making sure that our API would trust Auth0 JWT signed tokens. Passport would take a strategy that allow us to put as many different ways in which to authenticate as possible. We had only the API before, that's all we needed. Instead, we were able to add Auth0 to that list. And so it could go through and just say, oh, no, it's not the one that I signed. Is it maybe an Auth0? Yes, it is. Allow the request to go through. And so just a slight modification of that middleware allowed us to then start trusting the future Auth0 traffic. We're still not getting any in yet, but this is us handling these dependencies that actually don't have any other dependencies on themselves, and we can actually start getting them in. So to be clear, to reiterate, the previous task as far as the Auth0 backend and this one look a lot like what they were. Small branches, checked out, a couple days effort, or a couple days worth of development work, and then we get them right back into master after test, and we promote those deliveries on up through the environments so that we can get them into production and know that those are working well and integrated with the system. And I believe even we had instrumented a few of those with logging, so we could see, hey, which auth scheme are you using? Is this particular client still using the API? Is it using an Auth0 JWT? Just to give us some more information and feedback as stuff would get pushed out to production, as those supporting features would get pushed out into production. So that was our second one. Knocked out, good to go. All right, with our backend work mostly satisfied, we want to start shifting our focus to the front end. So in our React app, we went ahead and made some specialized components just to handle the Auth0 logins. And we decided to do those in basically a dark launch configuration where we'd have the components. They would be available. We just didn't publish the URLs. So we could get to them in the various environments. Testing can get to them. They're just not advertised for the average user to locate, to find anywhere in the app. So first couple of things that we needed were inside our Auth0 components were a login that would allow us to redirect over to the Auth0 widget to let them log in. And also we needed to be able to provide a component for Auth0 to call back into. And that was the authenticated endpoint that we needed to provide. So once we had those two, we could then, we were basically getting the Auth0 JWTs, OAuth2 style JWTs into our application to be able to pass around. The backend already was trusting them whenever they came in, so we didn't need to mess with that anymore. And we could start to actually play around with login a little bit, and knowing that our previous efforts allowed for our authentications to be happening on the API side. So again, this was again pulled out a smaller effort. The branch was short-lived. We got it back into master. We delivered it. It wound up making its way up through the environments, through tests, and landing into production, waiting there for us to be able to exercise whenever we would like, to make sure that we had a lot of the kinks ironed out. And so that, again, made the team feel a lot better. Okay, release is imminent. Things are going well. Next task we need to do is introduce a type of a mechanism in order to allow us to switch on and off the API, from the authentication from the API strategy to the Auth0 strategy, and back if need be. This is pretty basic for this particular task for us in our routing scheme in our code. We just introduced a toggle that would check, for instance, an environment variable. If Auth0 is enabled, great. Go to Auth0 for your login component. Otherwise, stick with the API that you've been using. In this particular instance, we just wanted to focus on the mechanism and make sure that it's defaulted to its current state. So there's no change in behavior in the system. This still technically is, it is definitely a delivery, not a release, because it's still in the off position and there's no change for the behavior at all to experience with this particular deployment. So next step is to finally throw that knife switch, turn it on. Okay, now it's time to turn on the feature. This is release day. This is what we've been working towards. And ideally, we want it to be a non-event. We've been practicing last several deliveries with getting this code into production, seeing how it works, both with the third-party Auth0 and our own systems and how it's behaving. So ideally, we want to maybe show up with a couple individuals that have been part of the effort. We switch it on, monitor for a little bit, and done. We go and start focusing on the next awesomeness that we can add to this application. So this makes development, delivery, releases so much more relaxed, a lot more fun, and can make the team a lot more confident, especially when looking at bigger changes that need to be made in what is proven to be successful software, when your users are asking, when your clients are asking for more types of behavior and great cool things to add to it. So it is kind of cause to celebrate. Okay, that pretty much wraps it up. I want to thank you for following along on one of our recent experiments with separating deliveries from releases. And I hope you gained maybe some insight or some ideas for your workflow, and look forward to hearing some feedback about that. Thanks.